Hello and welcome to Random Fandom from Billings Public Library, a video series about the things that we love. I am Barb. I'm a librarian at the library, and today I'm speaking with Brain Oestreich, who is the art director for the Art House and the Babcock Cinemas here in Billings. He curates a series at both theaters, a nostalgia night at the Babcock and late night movies at the Art House. And today we're talking about what cult movies are and what they do for their fans. And I hope that you stick through to the end of the video because we do cover a lot of movies. You might just find something that you'll want to seek out. I hope you enjoy.
I think that it would be useful to define the term cult movies for our watchers.
Your watchers, yeah.
I did find a definition from Danny Peary, who wrote a compilation, actually a couple of compilations in the 1980s called Cult Movies.
Okay.
He said that differing from mainstream movies that everybody more or less perceives in the same way, cult movies are born in controversy, in arguments over quality, themes, talent, and other matters. Would you agree with that definition, and what would you add on to that?
Yeah, so a lot of cult movies were born in the sense that they garnered this major following of mostly niche audiences that it didn't have the broad appeal of a lot of your mainstream movies. It was definitely whether it's an obscure title or something that just isn't for everyone, where we find a lot of cult films are diving into horror or exploitation or something like that just doesn't have a broad appeal, but then maybe just kind of scratches an itch that builds a wider appeal than even its niche, and kind of gets a following around it as well. So it's a lot of them tend to be things that bombed initially and then found their following later as well. So a lot of genre films, whether it's science fiction or horror, or even even the exploitation films, blaxploitation of the 70s, or anything that kind of gets into taboo territory can sort of get in there as well. And even some of your Chuck Norris action like flicks and stuff can be
Right.
all wrapped up in that.
Right, and some classics as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
As time goes on.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that something like It's a Wonderful Life was initially a bomb in 1946. It kind of fell into obscurity until around the 1970s, when TV syndication kind of picked up the rights to it, because no one was taking advantage of showing that film, and programmers of television were like, well, this kind of has a holiday feel to it. We'll just slap it on and it doesn't cost us hardly anything. And over the years, it kind of grew a following as a Christmas classic, in the sense that it just was always on at Christmas time, mostly because of cheap rights that they could get to it, but it certainly grew a following as well.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, other ones that we think of as classics, Nosferatu was one that was a little bit too obscure. It was German expressionism at the time, which was a little foreign to US audiences, but it was essentially a retelling of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which even Stoker's estate had sued the makers of Nosferatu for copyright infringement, but over the years it has kind of become an accepted horror classic as well, and grew a cult following. Some people preferring it over the later 1930s Universal classic version of Dracula.
Yeah, and it's been influential as well. Just
Absolutely.
that particular one. The imagery, and it's kind of spawned a whole style of vampire movies, I think. Do you think that cult movies have that potential to be influential, or are they mostly beloved by their audiences?
I think every single cult movie has some sort of influence, and that's part of what even can make them a cult movie. a good example would be something like in 2006, Paprika drew a lot of comparisons to 2010's Inception. After Inception came out, people kind of rewatched Paprika and noticed a lot of the influence that that film had on Inception. So you can see that influence. You can see the same with in 1999, a year before, or sorry, in 1999, The Matrix came out, but a year before that, there was a film, Dark City, that again, a lot of people were noticing the similarities of those films. So a lot of cult films are highly influential on later films, and then you can kind of look back at, this is where this filmmaker drew that inspiration from this cult film, and then can draw more attention to that prior film.
Right, right. Has that been the experience that you've had with the audiences that you see at your showings? Do you think
I see a lot. We do a lot of things. My mission statement with the late night films is to show films that are shocking, scary, or sorry, I need to remember my own motto now. Things that shock, scare, or are strange. And so that's kind of the mantra of my series there. And yeah, we see a lot of audiences just being, especially at a late hour, we find that your mind is more open to sort of the odd things that can be shown in films, and it's a unique experience to kind of watch something in that late hour, and you can appreciate it at a different hour than if you were watching it like 3 p.m. as well. But yeah, a lot of these older titles are things that are either beloved things that we grew up with. Evil Dead is one that definitely grew a following later on, and especially Sam Raimi has gone on. He ended up doing like Spider-Man films, so a lot of people were influenced by that. Peter Jackson's early films, after he did Lord of the Rings, it's easy to go back and say like, hey, this is where he got his start, and some of these early films, Meet the Feebles or Heavenly Creatures, have kind of gotten their own little following after the fact as well. So yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic you see with these films, that they have very hardcore fans that I mean, the quintessential cult film, I guess you could say, is the Rocky Horror Picture Show, that there are theaters that have been showing that film since it first came out 45 years ago, and they show it every single day. They do the call and response, they do the sing along. A lot of that grew not only in the culture depicted in the film, but also it had a lot to do with a positive representation of LGBTQ community, and or even just sexual openness in general was something that was communities that were excited to see that on film, or will continue to see that again and again. And yeah, it's sometimes it needs something that's a little bit more under the mainstream or counterculture to be able to really draw that influence, and you get that dedicated fan base. And yeah, it's a wonderful thing to see.
Right. And Rocky Horror is an example, of course, where the audience is really as important as anything that's going on the screen.
Absolutely. I mean, the event of going to a Rocky Horror film, I have yet to just watch the film at home just on a Sunday afternoon or something, but yeah, it's not exactly built for that. It is a film that is meant to be experienced with a group, and even if you took away the call and response thing, it is still something that is a community gathering, that all have this very similar mindset of how this film has affected them personally, politically, sexually, however it is. There's definitely something that film calls to. Other examples of something like that could be like Phantom of the Paradise, still has that musical feel to it, or Hedwig and the Angry Inch, a few like 30 years after that came out, and you know, kind of also kind of drew in with the trans community in that film as well. So it's yeah, there's a lot of these things. I mean, we could even go back to films like Boys Don't Cry, or or what are some of the other ones? The I'm Only a Cheerleader. I haven't seen this one, but I know of it. It's a lesbian film that came out in the early 2000s, I believe, that is pretty campy, that a lot of that is pretty well regarded in that community as well. And it's, you know, these are films that, again, these communities relate to and like to experience again and again with each other.
Right, right. So when you say shocking or surprising, also transgressive, it sounds like in some ways,
Yeah.
or
even
open.
at their time they were maybe more shocking, but have, you know, become much more accepted as well. I'm sure there are audiences you could find today that would still be pretty shocked with Rocky Horror, or, you know, or we can go to something like Pink Flamingos in 1972 has a very strong following with it. But I mean, that film was it was made to be shocking, grotesque, and everything.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Do you
Could
find
even
then that
say, I mean,
people?
to a degree, you know, a lot of the art house cinemas that would show these cult films, a lot of them started as pornography theaters as well. And even pornography has its own, you know, certain films like Deep Throat or something is got its own cult following as well.
Right. Do you think that the audiences that go to your movies now, to your late nights, do you think that there's been an effect over time? Certainly things that used to be shocking maybe are not so much. Also, there's a lot more ability of these films. Whereas, you know, I can remember in college going to a theater that would show double features, where they might show 2 John Waters movies, or the next week it might be like 4 Marx Brothers movies, or, you know, different things that kind of had that niche following. But these days, it wouldn't be as difficult, I think, to find those sorts of films in one way or another. And do you think that that's how do you think that fans react now or respond now to the midnight movies or the
I
cult
think
movie?
I think that, you know, as cult movies have kind of progressed, you know, from those early days, Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu in the silent era, and then like the midnight movies being birthed with like El Topo and Eraserhead and Monty Python and the Holy Grail sort of thing, like those kind of started in their, you know, the art house community kind of helped these people find each other and build a community in that sense. Once they started showing up in the late 60s, 70s, and that as we go into the 80s, there was more of a community that was built within the video stores when these films started getting released on VHS, and people would congregate there, and they would kind of find their community there with you know, the store clerk recommending, like, hey, have you seen Reanimator? Have you seen Blade Runner? Anything like that? You know, people kind of finding a connection that way. And as we've gone on, you know, in the internet age with social media and that, we get these people, you know, I grew up in a small town, so I know that, you know, my experience with the video store maybe wasn't quite getting me there, but I would discover something in that video store and think that I was the only one that knew of this. I'm the only one that knows of The Princess Bride or Dune or something like that. And then online you start finding these other people that you know, love this film, and you find that there is this following that surrounds this film, and you can find a sense of community there as well. And then to be able to, you know, again, you know, something like Labyrinth or The Dark Crystal that, you know, you grew up watching and you wore out that VHS tape, you've even found that community, but then Art House or the Babcock says, hey, we're showing Labyrinth this weekend. then you kind of get this community again to be like, I love that film. And I mean, there's certain films out there that I was unaware of the cult following that has kind of grown, even though I grew up with like Hocus Pocus. I didn't understand how much that film has kind of become a cult favorite over the years. Whereas when I first saw it, it was just like, it's a Halloween movie.
Right.
So
Yeah, definitely. So then there's that other element of
I think
nostalgia.
meme culture has also kind of helped grow that as well, where, if someone sees this image that, they've gotten familiar with, and then later find out where that image actually comes from, and they start to associate that office space of something where, the boss with the coffee cup saying, I'm going to need you to come in on Sunday. It's like it just kind of becomes this
and
thing.
the red swing line stapler, yeah.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point, that a lot of that community building is happening online at this point, and then they can experience it when they go down to the Babcock for a nostalgia night, or to one of your late night showings. Yeah. So, what was your personal experience with cult movies? Have you, aside from the video stores, did you attend a lot of showings or is this something that's developed later?
So, I mean, I collected a lot of VHSs growing up, and experienced a lot that way. When I got to college, our campus would that was the first time I saw Rocky Horror as a group, and that was quite the experience to be able to do that. But there was also there was a video store in town, actually. I went in Bozeman, and there was a video store called Bad Taste that would host campus screenings maybe on a monthly basis or so, and they would kind of show films. I saw Lost Highway there. I saw Videodrome, I believe, and I know they showed Cannibal Holocaust. I didn't go to that one, but I know that was one that that was shown. Especially at that time, found footage was kind of the big thing. Blair Witch had already happened, and it was kind of becoming more and more that you're seeing these found footage films, and to be able to point back and say Cannibal Holocaust was like one of the first to really try out that found footage thing was quite interesting. Now, but I did not go to that one, but that was definitely where I started experiencing cult films that I was unfamiliar with, and seeing that there was a good 50 of us or so that were going on a regular basis to check out what they were showing there. And then it's I always enjoy seeing some of those older scary movies and finding that gosh, some of these newer scary films sometimes aren't as scary as those old ones. I think it's something to do with the film grain, the production quality, almost the seediness of it can almost make it a little bit more frightening, because you almost feel like there are no rules here. Something like Last House on the Left is going to be infinitely more scary to me than something that's a little bit more polished. Like Hereditary just is a little too polished. Like, and don't get me wrong, Hereditary is great, but it's there's something about that seediness of those early films that can make it feel like almost you don't know what you're going to see in this almost.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And there are a few filmmakers, again, influence, that go on. There are still taking that, right? I think of like Quentin Tarantino and Pulp Fiction, for example. Still a little more polished than those early like 70s horror movies, but definitely taking that aesthetic,
Yeah, definitely have that influence, and they've done things like I Spit on Your Grave was remade recently, and by recently it was like 10 years ago or something, but they'll sometimes take that same idea and remake it, but again, it almost feels a little too polished, and but you can definitely see the influence that this filmmaker had. It's definitely interesting.
Yeah, and it's often but not always the low budget aspect of it, do you think? Or
hmm Yeah,
that
the low
plays
budget,
in?
yeah, kind of also gives it that feeling like, some people might watch something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre now and feel like this isn't that scary, but at the time it was definitely very shocking to see something like that. And again,
Mhm.
like it was shot in this sort of guerrilla style that
Right.
you don't really know like what you're getting into. Like this could be shot in someone's house, and you know, Cannibal Holocaust, of course, was one of the big
Right.
ones that uh, you know, they believed that that might have been real life at the time. They thought that this was actually happening, that these people on camera were really dying, and they had to actually go out and prove that this person is still alive in order to. They rode that
Wow.
way for marketing
Sure,
purposes for
sure.
sure, but then
Yeah,
at a
yeah, yeah.
certain point, once the law became involved, then it's like, oh no, they're alive.
No, they're okay. So, and then earlier you mentioned camp, and certainly there are some cult movies that have a camp
For sure.
feel to them. Rocky Horror for sure has a bit of
Rocky
that.
Horror for sure. Even earlier, I mentioned Reanimator, which
Right.
kind of took H.P. Lovecraft's story and really made a campy version of that, and
Hmm.
the eating the scenery and the overacting
Right.
to really
Right.
help with that. But there are the films too, things like Reefer Madness from the 30s that was then replayed and kind of as a camp of like, this is how seriously they took it back then, and then come 60s,
Mhm.
70s, it was a joke really. And
Right.
there's things like
Right.
that.
Right.
Plan 9 from Outer Space, definitely one where we're just looking at the shoddy filmmaking of Ed Wood,
Hmm.
and same with The Room years
Right.
later, where we enjoy The Room. um, we're kind of in the making of a whole new cult film, a new cult classic with Cats from last year, I guess, that
Oh,
people are already starting to, as someone in the theater world, other theaters have been talking about how they've seen a resurgence in showing Cats at midnight, and it brings in a
okay.
whole different crowd that appreciates it a whole different way. So
Just on the camp level. That's awesome.
yeah.
I did want to get, now that we've talked about a lot of different films, do you have any recommendations for people who might want to start to explore the cult movies, like sort of just beyond their own experiences? Do you have ones
Yeah.
you'd recommend?
So, I mean, I've mentioned a lot that are great. Some of your essentials would be like your Rocky Horror, your El Topo, um, Plan 9 from Outer Space, Night of the Living Dead,
Sure.
uh, Evil Dead, those sort of things. Repo Man is a great one that, you
Right.
know, that one's surprising in the sense that it ever got made, because that was made by Universal. Like that was a big studio that put their weight
Right.
behind that, and then
Yeah.
it didn't find an audience until VHS, especially with kids that liked punk rock but weren't exactly going out to the theater, but they would rent this VHS. And
Hmm.
I know so many people that have never seen the film, but they love the soundtrack, so
Right.
that kind
Definitely
of
remember
helped
that
as well.
soundtrack.
But
Yeah.
yeah, those are some great ones. If you want to dig a little deeper, there's an amazing film. I showed it at Halloween last year, called House, that was made in 1977 in Japan,
Okay.
and
Oh,
it's
okay.
and that it is so unique in the sense of the visual style. The filmmaker behind it has done mostly commercials, and so the innovation in effects that he did, I mean, they look very cheap now, but
Mm.
at the time, I mean, there is sort of a charmingness to the cheapness of these effects as well.
Right. Right.
But the best way to explain this film is that it is a haunted house film with
Okay.
these Japanese schoolgirls locked in this house, and it is also like a live action Scooby-Doo as well, in the sense that the campiness and the way that they try to solve the mystery, and just how goofy it can be, but also have some genuine scares in it as well.
Uh-huh.
Is
Wow.
It's absolutely a great gem if you get a chance to find it. And
Okay.
it also kind of had this resurgence. It was unseen in the United States for a good 30 years, and then
Mhm.
the Criterion Collection released a version of it, and that's where it kind of
Okay.
grew more of a US audience. I am not the
Right.
only art house in the country that plays this every Halloween, so
Mhm. Awesome. All right, I'm gonna have to look
hopefully
for
we'll
that
do
one.
something like that. I am also a huge Eraserhead fan.
Mhm.
It's where Lynch got his start, and he famously spent 5 years making this on a shoestring budget, where it was like, "Hey, I made $100 this week. Let's go film a scene," sort of thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
that one is still, and the effects in that again are just, you don't think of it. You don't think of the effects being this major component of it. A lot of people think of the strangeness of the film and the abstractness of the storytelling, but
Mhm.
um, you know, not to give anything away. And I don't want anyone to. If you have not seen Eraserhead, you should go in with a completely no expectations with it. Just go
Okay.
for the ride.
Yeah.
But there are some effects in that I think to this day, a lot of people are unsure exactly how he achieved those effects that are so realistic looking. And, a lot of
Mhm.
people think he probably was raiding a butcher's shop or something in order to get some of that stuff. So,
And it's amazing. Well, I'm really happy to hear that cult films are alive and well. And
yes. And I think,
yeah.
especially, the way that, Netflix has kind of definitely had an effect on theaters, and especially in COVID-19, everyone was home for a while. Even new films were starting to become streaming. Um, so I think that there's something to be said that if you can find a community that can gather around a film that you know is very personal to you, then that's one reason to go back to the theater and check
Yeah.
these out. And a lot of these are harder to find because they weren't big hits. So they're not there isn't, Netflix isn't chomping at the bit to bring in
To
this
bring it
film that
out.
might only get a few downloads a week.
Mhm.
It's definitely something. I mean, Eraserhead, I think the Criterion channel, I think, has it if you subscribe to
Uh-huh.
that, but any of the mainstream ones, they're not going to have that film there. And it's nice to be able to, again, it's not something you even necessarily want to watch by yourself anyway. You want to have that group experience of watching this and
Mhm.
talking about it, and you
Mhm.
know reliving your favorite moment in conversation of like, I can't believe that, or what was he trying to say with this and that. It's definitely something that I think the art houses of the country have done very well with showing films like
Mhm.
that to kind of build on the conversation and do something outside the mainstream that will expand your thoughts on cinema. And
Right.
yeah, we're glad to be able to do that for this community.
Yeah, we're really happy that you are doing that. Thank you so much, Brian. I really appreciate this.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Glad you reached out to me. If you need anything else, because again, I could go on for a whole nother hour on this. So this is
I love talking about it. Yeah, I've
exactly.
had a lot of
I have the
fun.
best
Hope
job
you
in the
have
world. You can put that in. I have the best job in the world.
I'll subtitle it that.
All right.
Thanks, Brian. Take
Thanks.
care.
All right. Bye.